According to UNDP, Vietnam is the list of 5 countries more vulnerable to climate change. According to World Bank's report, without further commitments and actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the world is likely to warm by more than 3 Celsius degrees above the pre-industrial. If the global temperature grows up 4 Celsius degrees, associated with sea level could rise 0.5 to 1 meter or more. By then, Vietnam would lose 5% of its land area. 11% of people living in Vietnam would lose their homes. Agricultural products could decrease by 7% and national GDP decrease by 10%. Amidst palpable threats for the planet in 2010, almost 200 countries agreed that the rise in temperature of the Earth should be hard to reach, because the use of fossil energy or dirty energy would not be improved in the near future. UN Climate Conference on Doha on December 2012, or COP18, like previous COPs, did not come to any strong enough constraints for nations to reduce their emissions significantly.
Hello everyone, and you're watching Sharing Vietnam only on NetViet VTC10. I'm Jasmine, hosting the show for tonight. Our guest for today, an advisor on climate change from UNDP, Mr. Cos Niviers, is going to share with us about his opinions on the climate change-related financings for Vietnam in 2013. So please welcome Mr. Cos. Thank you for joining us in the show tonight.
Thank you.
So after COP18, what do you see in the potential funding for climate changes in Vietnam for 2013?
Actually, last year, in 2012, at COP18, not very many decisions were made about climate financing. Many discussions happened in the side options about the big new fund called the Green Climate Fund. But critical to know is that Vietnam actually is one of the biggest recipients already of climate finance. So on the one hand, that means Vietnam should not expect a lot more, because it is already, as I say, receiving a lot compared to other countries. Vietnam is, however, well placed to, in the future, maybe after 2013, to receive more money for various purposes.
What should be the balance between adaptation and mitigation for climate change?
I think Vietnam has many policies on climate change. It has a climate change strategy, it has a national green growth strategy, it has a national action plan, it has sectoral, provincial action plans. It also has very specific action plans on forestry, or on what I call deforestation and forest degradation in the context of climate change. This is excellent. Now, most of that is focused on adaptation, which makes a lot of sense. But we also believe that there is not a sharp distinction between climate change adaptation, or adaptation to the effects of climate change, and the need for mitigation, or in other words, reducing emissions. So for example, in the forestry sector, if you plant a tree, it can protect against floods, and it can also protect water resources, and at the same time it can capture carbon. Furthermore, we believe that there are different sources of funding involved. A lot of mitigation of emissions is useful for Vietnam simply because it's useful, not because of the world, not because the world tells Vietnam to do so.
But because it's helpful for the adaptation,
exactly.
It has adaptation effects as well, right?
Maybe, but also simply because mitigation for Vietnam can also mean that it saves money, that air pollution reduces. And so there are other benefits, financial and sometimes environmental or even social. And Vietnam needs to look at all the benefits, not only climate change.
If there's obvious benefits to green energy, why can't more developed countries can't put that together?
Actually, they are doing it. Even the USA is doing it already. Recently, I read an article about another investment in the USA for one solar power plant of $2.5 billion. China is now almost the leading country in the world in terms of how many windmills it builds and solar panels it produces. Already rapidly becoming bigger on solar panels than compared to Germany, which has been the leader.
Developed countries are deemed most responsible for high levels of emissions that cause greenhouse effects. However, poorer and developing countries are the ones more vulnerable to climate change. If not controlled properly, global warming can reduce global GDP by 3.2% in 2030. According to a research by Global Climate Forum and DARA, an organization based in Spain. At the same time, according to this report, climate change can increase GDPs of some developing countries by 11% in 2030. Other big economies experience lighter effects due to severe weather conditions with related losses such as drought, flood, and hurricanes.
So you say that besides the coal, the fossil energy, the more developed countries are developing their green sector, right? And your point is Vietnam should pay more attention to develop its own green sector, right?
That is my point, but it is particularly my point to say that Vietnam has its own self-interest to do so. I also want to qualify what I say about developed countries. They are not doing as much as they can do. They can do more. The German government has been a leading government, and maybe the Danish government is a leading government. But there are other governments who can do considerably more for their long-term future, energy production as well as energy efficiency measures. The technology in those countries is now very advanced, as it is in China, Japan, South Korea. And Vietnam must find ways of bringing that technology to this country.
So coming back to my question again, if there is certain benefit to green energy, to their own development in the future, what causes the failure of COP18?
The problems in COP18 and before, as well as probably later, meaning later this year, are partially about funding. So developed countries, like particularly the European countries, are facing economic stresses. That means that they are reducing their future commitments to money. But as I have already stressed, in the sidelines of the COP, all rich countries, including Japan and the USA, were stressing that they are of the intention to continue to increase climate financing. I think the second reason why there appears to be not very much success in COP18 is not because of the money, but because of the commitments nationally towards reducing emissions in the rich countries. Support has been limited, the political support, because people feel it costs them too much money, because they don't really feel that climate change is real. Now, with certain events, currently, right now, as well as in the past year or 2 years, 3 years, they are hopefully and sadly changing the sentiment of the voters in the developed world. So it was a very heavy storm called Sandy that hit New York late last year. This changed politics in the United States to some extent.
But my point is Vietnam cannot depend on the sentiments or the sympathy of other developed countries. They should be the ones who pay the tax for their pollution, right?
All of that is agreed. Whether it is a tax or by other means, but yes, transfers need to happen, and they are happening. The big question is how much.
So your point is which Vietnam should do it the softer way, in which instead of negotiation on finance, we should switch to technology transfer, which is Vietnam obviously can take advantage of, right?
No, I don't think it needs to take a softer approach. I think it needs to do both. Financial transfers, technology transfers, both are needed. And then Vietnam needs to simply realize that it works on its own devices, primarily. Don't look to the rest of the world for solving the problem. So scientific exchanges help this country. So by increasing those, there is not a lot of money transfer or technology transfer, but knowledge transfer. Vietnam will benefit from that. So it is very good for Vietnam to remain soft enough to be friends with everybody.
For what Vietnam can do for its own, like what can Vietnam do to attract more investment in the green area?
Vietnam should use the ODA, the climate financing from other countries, very smartly, very strategically. At the moment, there seems to be a lot of that money goes into some infrastructure investment, which is quite basic, dikes and dams, and some not very high technologies. So that we don't think is very strategic. It needs to use that limited amount of money for real high tech, for innovative actions, and money needs to go to the localities. It needs to support programs such as the climate resilience in communities, or what we call community-based disaster management.
We need adaptation, but we have to steer it toward mitigation for them to invest the money in. So how should public financing, be oriented so it can influence other kind of investment into the sector that we want?
That is only possible at a large scale to reduce emissions. So for climate change adaptation to encourage the private sector will have limited success. The public sector, the government, and the local authorities need to take most responsibilities. For adaptation to climate change, it's very difficult to look for private sector investment, but it is possible to say private investment in infrastructure like roads, bridges, which is happening, can be climate-proofed. That means that the designs of those infrastructures need to be such that they are helping the safety of the country. They help prevent flooding, or they help prevent droughts. Now, if that happens, this infrastructure becomes a little bit more expensive. So what you can do as a country is you can regulate for changes in the design standards of those infrastructures.
In your view, our last question for you is what can Vietnam do, or what can be done to use the aid money and investment money most effectively?
There are three things I want to answer to that question. One is what I already kind of indicated, and that is that more money has to go to the localities. More money has to be used strategically. And what I mean by that is climate ODA. More strategic, more to the localities. To actions around crop variety development, infrastructure investment, and high-tech related technologies, but also community-based disaster risk reduction. The second thing is that science needs to be reinforced and connected to practitioners. So what we are doing right now with a number of institutes and universities in Vietnam is to bring together all the data that exist in Vietnam and about Vietnam on climatic extremes and how they are changing as a result of climate change. And then the second product will be we extract from there the practical experiences and recommendations to ensure that the right climate change adaptation actions happen, meaning the most cost-effective, the ones that have best benefits for local people, and in the best way. The third part of my answer to your question is on mitigation of emissions. The biggest problem of Vietnam for the future is its current plans to ensure that more than half of all its electricity in 2030 would be produced by coal. Coal is the worst fossil fuel, globally speaking. Coal is cheap right now. Coal is partly available in Vietnam right now, but for the future not. For the future, Vietnam needs to import all of that. We think these projections are understandable if you look at today's data, but they are contradicted by predictions of the price of renewable energy, meaning biofuels, but particularly wind and solar energy. So we think that Vietnam needs to adjust those plans. It needs to prime, it needs to become part of renewable energy markets in a much more aggressive way. India is another example of a country that can demonstrate that you can do it very cheaply, almost as cheaply as coal already, right now, under certain conditions. So no need to wait for that. With 5 or 10 years, even today, it can start.
Because thank you very much for sharing with us your views and your advices.
You're most welcome.
And that concludes our show for tonight. Thank you very much for watching Sharing Vietnam. If you have any questions or comments, please send us an email at sharingvietnam@gmail.com. I'm Jasmine and see you next time.
Xin cảm ơn biên tập viên Thanh Hằng và ông coach Nipjet về những chia sẻ thú vị vừa rồi. Và tiếp theo chương trình, mời quý vị và các bạn cùng gặp lại biên tập viên Thành Long để đến với câu chuyện hội nhập ngày hôm nay.
Cảm ơn biên tập viên Hồng Giang. Thưa quý vị và các bạn, quan hệ giữa hai nước Anh Việt đã bước lên tầm cao mới khi tuyên bố đối tác chiến lược Việt Nam Vương quốc Anh ra đời. Và trong câu chuyện hội nhập của ngày hôm nay, chúng tôi sẽ đề cập đến triển vọng của mối quan hệ này.